Welcome to the Anti-Racism Invited Panel of the 2021 Lilly Conference, Reckoning and Reimagining, Envisioning a Faithful Presence in the Liberal Arts. My name is Kirsten Songkyo-Oh, Professor of Practical Theology here at APU, and as the coordinator of this invited panel and roundtable discussions around the anti-racism theme, I'd like to reiterate the theme's intent to start off this panel. Anti-racism, how can we work to address a legacy of racist policies and practices in our country, especially in light of the COVID-19 pandemic? This theme centers all who want to work to address the systemic racism that became even more exposed during the COVID-19 pandemic. In particular, we lift the voices of women scholars and activists who are speaking from their reflected and reflexive experiences to examine their unique communities' histories and engagement with the issues surrounding racist injustices and policies in the United States. This morning, I'm honored to host the anti-racism panel with three distinguished guests, Dr. Deborah Rogers, Dr. Michelle Ami Reyes, and Reverend Alexandra Zareth. Each of the panelists will present a 15-minute talk on their particular stories of both personal and communal engagement with anti-racism. These talks then will be followed by a question and answer session. Our first panelist is Dr. Deborah Rogers, who serves as the Vice President for Academic Affairs and Associate Professor of Theology, Culture, and the Practice of Ministry at Colgate, Rochester, Crozer Divinity School. She will reflect on the ways in which Black women's bodies are perceived as a threat and the life or death vulnerabilities that accompany this perception. Dr. Rogers.
Thank you. I'm starting a timer just so I keep myself close to on time. Corinne Gaines' mother, Rhonda Dormius, describes her daughter as outspoken against police violence. In early 2016, Corinne had suffered a miscarriage after an encounter with the police. On August 1st, 2016, Corinne had been in a standoff with the police. The incident took place inside her home. Police claimed that they shot Corinne because she had a gun and their lives were in danger. However, police monitored the situation via video cameras and surveillance from a neighbor's apartment. Corinne also streamed the standoff via social media. During the standoff, police won a court battle to shut down Corinne's social media. After police had Facebook shut down and the live feed that centered Corinne as subject was no longer available, they shot her through a wall, hitting her in the back. An officer then shot her 3 more times, even though she was incapacitated. The Baltimore Sun notes, while more of the case file presents the police version of events, Gaines' voice is present through the extensive recordings she made while police staged outside her home. She used her phone to communicate with the outside world through an array of platforms, including text messages, FaceTime, Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat. The department ultimately took the unprecedented step of asking Facebook and Instagram to temporarily deactivate her accounts, believing social media was distracting her from negotiations with police. Key points in the encounter, including when officers entered the apartment and fatal shots were fired, were not recorded, either by Gaines or the police. The officers involved were not wearing body cameras. And that was from the Baltimore Sun. Corinne Gaines was 23 years old when she was killed by the police. Her 5-year-old son, Cody, witnessed his mother's death and was also injured. Corinne Gaines' death suggested the ability of Black women to center themselves in the narrative is a matter of life and death. When Black women are not centered, when they are pushed to the periphery, they become dispensable objects. In the current context, where Black women rarely control the narrative, this dispensability of Black life, and particularly Black life in a female gendered body, is considered inconsequential. Through their Say Her Name campaign, the African American Policy Forum has intentionally called attention to the atrocities of Black women and girls killed by the police and the paucity of coverage their deaths have received. Over 100 Black women and girls are documented in this work from ages ranging from 7 years old to 93. While this is not an easy place to begin, it is an appropriate place to begin as we read the texts and lives of Black women and girls. During their June 17, 2020, Under the Black Light special via Zoom and YouTube, the mothers and sisters of 5 Black women killed by the police spoke to the lives, deaths, and the individual and collective trauma surrounding these events. The forum highlighted the intersectional vulnerabilities that often frame deadly encounters between Black women, Black girls, and the police. These intersectional vulnerabilities include the following: being Black, having mental health challenges, being transgender, being female, identifying as LGBTQ+. Reading these bodies requires an intersectional frame and highlights the intersectional dimensions of vulnerability that the bodies and lives of Black women and girls encompass. The dehumanization of Black girls and women is also seen in the ways in which Black families are controlled when their loved ones are victims of police violence. Family members are prohibited from intervening or advocating for their daughters in standoffs with the police, to the point of being held at gunpoint. The pervasive control of Black bodies, penalizing Black girls for advocating for their own safety or well-being to the point of death, continued separation and control of Black families up to and including death are pervasive. A tragic example of this is the documented killing of Tamir Rice by police and the detaining of his sister in handcuffs when she attempted to come to her brother's aid and advocate for medical intervention after he was shot by the police in particular. Black women and girls are penalized anytime they try to control their own bodies or exercise autonomy over their own persons, including in their homes, in their cars, with their children or their siblings. Black women and girls, like their male counterparts, are perceived on sight and rendered immediately invisible by police officers. As Sharon Cooper, Sandra Bland's sister, notes, they, the police officers, do not see their own mothers, sisters, or friends. They see an object that is perceptively out of control by society's standards and needs to be put under control. The AAPF notes the gender dimensions of anti-Black violence against women. Black bodies are often viewed as aggressive or threatening, and Black female bodies, or Black bodies that identify as female, are perceived as available for gendered discipline. Hence, Black girls and women are frequently blamed for their own deaths. The narrative that is given to survivors is that their loved ones were responsible for their own murders. And often out of justifiable fear of the police, the false narratives that the police put out are not corrected. This also contributes to a reality that the police are not communally held responsible for the murder of Black women and girls in the same way they are for Black men and boys. This further contributes to the erasure of Black women and girls when their lives are snuffed out. It also speaks to the multidimensional trauma of children left behind when their mothers are killed by the police. Additionally, there does not exist any substantive or supportive or organized support that is offered to families of victims of police violence. And in some cases, they have even received bills from police departments. Additional adverse consequences of the families of those killed by the police include health consequences, again, up to and including death, financial costs, custody battles, inaccurate media coverage, and mental health consequences. There is a particular and complicated narrative and understanding that emerges when the lives of Black women and girls killed by the police are centered. Ayanna Monet Stanley Jones was 7 years old when she was shot and killed by police during a raid on her grandmother's apartment. It is unimaginable to understand why police would need to, 1, fire a flash grenade through the front window of the apartment, and 2, what threat a grandmother with no weapons and a sleeping granddaughter, both females, posed to officers such that they were prepared to and did in fact use deadly force. Ayanna Monet and her grandmother, Myrtilla Jones, were not seen as human. Their lives did not matter. The carrying out of terror and state-sanctioned violence in a particular place was a higher priority than the safety and well-being of humans who were gendered and Black. Reading the text of Ayanna's life and that of her grandmother points to the intersectional vulnerabilities of Black women and girls that converge at the intersection of race, gender, and class. This intersection points to a set of distinct characteristics and challenges that impact the growth and development of African-American adolescent girls. These include poverty, the invisibility of the Black female gendered body, notions of painlessness of the Black female gendered body, the commitment to the maintenance of white body supremacy, and trauma, including individual, communal, and intergenerational trauma and adverse childhood experiences. Reading the lives of Ayanna and her grandmother, we see a text in which Black women and girls live and die in a perpetual state of terror. They live with the reality that their race, class, gender, and the location of their homes in particular make them vulnerable to unmitigated state violence from which there is no retreat and which requires no provocation prior to its enforcement. Reading the lives of Ayanna, Corinne, Ayanna's grandmother lead to a highlighting of these mentioned above elements: poverty, invisibility, painlessness, white body supremacy, and continuing trauma. And I will try in the remaining time to address these briefly. While Black girls and women do not have to be poor to live in a marginalized community or live in a marginalized community to be murdered by the police, the likelihood that she will be increases if she does live in an impoverished area. Here it is important to consider the, quote, founding of the United States and the role of capitalism and its relationship to slavery in the United States. Chattel slavery in the United States, with its deliberate, emergent, and convenient system of race-based castes, clearly led to the depth and breadth of poverty that we see in the United States today, which disproportionately affects Black women and girls in relation to their representation in the general population. This poverty marks what Black women and girls experience, as well as what they lack access to. This may include marginal schooling opportunities, minimal healthcare access, limited prenatal care and access, inadequate housing, experience of the incarceration of a parent, food or housing insecurity. The stresses associated with the instability that poverty brings is its own adverse effect, which then exacerbates the others to impact mental, physical, and the emotional well-being of individuals and communities. Multi-generational poverty is another relic of capitalism and chattel slavery, which makes it even more difficult for African-American women and girls to climb out of poverty, as in many cases, there is no clear path. In the era of COVID-19, limited access to Wi-Fi, electronic devices, dedicated learning spaces, and limited parental involvement in learning may be additional challenges that characterize the lives of young Black girls and adolescents living in the intersection of race, gender, and poverty. Invisibility, painlessness, and white supremacy. As noted earlier, police rendered Corinne Gain invisible before killing her. Black women and girls live in tension with each other and tension within themselves. It is not that Black women always want to be the, quote, strong Black women. It is that our very survival has necessitated the same. And whether it is caught or taught, girls tend to emulate the culture that is around them. This necessity of the strong Black woman has often been intentionally or conveniently read as a Black female gendered body that is impervious to pain. The Black female gendered body is both rendered painless and invisible by others. This includes police and citizen cops who read the Black female gendered body as a threat, even when no obvious threat exists, and then, quote, neutralize the threat by subduing Black female gendered bodies up to and including killing them. Within this same category in the United States, systematic priority of the maintenance of white supremacy, which tends to require the erasure of any body which interferes in theory or practice with white body supremacy, especially white male-bodied supremacy. It is, in fact, these notions of painlessness that lead to the killing and other means of erasure of Black female gendered bodies that then perpetuates the structure of white body supremacy through literal erasure, state-sanctioned violence, and terror against non-white bodies that assert any mean of agency. For the sake of time, I will stop there and just end with this note here. In his book, My Grandmother's Hands, Resmaa Menakem describes the way that all bodies in the United States are inhabited by the history of white body supremacy. For most Americans, and this is a quote, for most Americans, including most of us with dark skin, white body supremacy has become part of our bodies. How could it not? It's equivalent of a toxic chemical we ingest on a daily basis. Eventually, it changes our brains and the chemistry of our bodies, which is why, in looking at white body supremacy, we need to begin not with guilt or blame, but with our bodies. Menakem goes on to note that no matter what we look like, if we were born and raised in America, white body supremacy and our adaptations to it are in our blood. Our very bodies house the unleashed dissonance and trauma of our ancestors. This is why white body supremacy continues to persist in America and why so many African Americans continue to die from it, end quote. As such, Black women and girls hold in their bodies multi-generational trauma in addition to any present day trauma, even if it is not part of their explicit consciousness and may not be known or acknowledged by others. Thank you.
Our second panelist is Dr. Michelle Ami Reyes, who is the Vice President of the Asian American Christian Collaborative and author of Becoming All Things: How Small Changes Lead to Lasting Connections Across Cultures. She will speak on the anti-Asian racism during the time of COVID-19. Dr. Reyes.
Hi, and thank you for having me. So I want to start by talking about how in the early months of 2020, I began to witness the first incidents of anti-Asian racism fueled by the COVID-19 pandemic, and things became personal very quickly. So in March of last year, I had a complete stranger shout at me to, quote, go home. And around the same time, I had a woman stop me and my children out on a walk in our own neighborhood. And she wouldn't let us pass on the sidewalk until I proved that I lived in that community. And both of those incidents were an immediate reminder that people often see Asian Americans like me, not only as foreigners, but as foreign threats. And even back then, I wondered how long it would take for these sorts of racist rhetoric and hate crimes to escalate. And, first we were shouted at, then we were coughed on, then we were spit at, then we were shoved and kicked and pushed, then we were slashed and stabbed, then we were doused in acid and fire, and now Asian bodies have also been shot and murdered. So on the evening of March 16th, 2021, a 21-year-old white male shot and killed 8 people at Asian-owned spas in Atlanta, Georgia, and 6 of the people killed were Asian women. And the effects of that massacre on the Asian American community has been visceral, including myself. Many of us haven't slept well, thinking about how it could have been our own mothers and grandmothers. I myself did not sleep for weeks and had nightmares and just felt nauseous and sick to my stomach. Others have taken to social media to share this collective fear, grief, lament, rage, even over escalating anti-Asian violence and trauma that now feels overwhelming. Because we're tired. We're tired of waking up to the news of yet another Asian man or woman being attacked or assaulted or murdered. Recently, Asian Americans throughout the country have been targeted at skyrocketing rates. And in the early weeks of February, there was a string of attacks against Asian elders. And this included Visha Ratanapakdi, an 84-year-old Thai-American man who was killed in an unprovoked attack, a 64-year-old Vietnamese American woman who was attacked and robbed in broad daylight in San Jose, and Noel Quintana, a 61-year-old Filipino American who was slashed in the face with a box cutter as he rode the subway. And then on Tuesday, February 16th, 2 Asian American women were randomly attacked in New York City. One was punched in the face, the other in the back of the head. And many of us also recently learned about the attack of 30-year-old Filipino veteran Angelo Quinto, who was murdered by the police in December 2020. We're just hearing about the news now that one officer knelt on his neck for at least 5 minutes as Quinto pleaded, "Please don't kill me." And a horrifying video was recorded by his own mother of this event until the moment that he stopped breathing. And so despite all of this, and while the Asian American community continues to suffer under the weight of these incidents, almost every time I mention this kind of violence in person or online, too often the response is, I'm so sorry, I didn't know. And, media outlets have only loosely covered issues related to anti-Asian racism, and often not right away. And this is what prompted civil rights activist Amanda Nguyen to call on CNN, MSNBC, journalists, quote, this is what she said in her IG reel, journalists with massive platforms to cover the death of Visha Ratanapakdi. And Nguyen went on to say, quote, "Our community is being attacked and we are dying to be heard." So Asian Americans, we experience a double threat in this country. We are the victims of racial violence, and our experiences are continually erased. And it is time for a reckoning with Asian American history. And in my talk today, I'm going to look at the historical reasons for the erasure of Asian American oppression and racial violence, and show how the lived experiences of Asian Americans, including the racism we endure, must be viewed as essential in our understanding of the American story. But first, where does the silence about anti-Asian violence and racism come from? You see, our society doesn't place a high value on the Asian American experience and voice, and we are considered a second-class issue and not worthy of mainstream attention. And much of this has to do with the stereotypes that people consciously or subconsciously hold about us. Historically, 2 of the forces that have caused Asian Americans to be overlooked is first the perpetual foreigner syndrome, which is that Asians are assumed foreigners until proven otherwise. And the second is the model minority myth, which is that Asian Americans are thought of as somehow racially smarter or more successful than other minority groups. So I want to unpack those one by one. So first, Asians are assumed foreigners until proven otherwise. We are perpetual guests in someone else's home. And no matter how hard we try to fit in or how long we've been here, we're never seen as American enough. And this perspective leads to questions like, where are you from? Or no, but where are you really from? Even when I say that I'm from Austin or that I grew up in Minnesota, people that ask, but but aren't you from India? Or like, where were you born? And even if I tell them that I was born in South Carolina, there's sometimes some looks of confusion that linger. It's also just a matter of time before then we're asked, how do you speak English so well? Or how do you not have an accent? People say something like how surprising it is that we're not so Asian. And the reason is because Asian Americans are assumed to be a perpetual foreigner, that we don't originally belong here. It doesn't matter if we don't even identify solely as with our ethnicity. The perpetual foreigner syndrome has infected this entire country, and the church isn't immune to this problem either. As I mentioned before, during the time of COVID-19, we've seen that Asian Americans are perceived not just as foreigners, but a foreign threat. And in the words of Fuller professor Dr. Song-Chan Rah, we've gone from pet to threat. And we've watched in horror as our country has latched onto this current global pandemic crisis to advance anti-immigrant, white supremacist, and xenophobic conspiracy theories that demonize not just Chinese Americans, but the Asian community as a whole. But it's important to understand that Asian Americans are no strangers to racism. And in fact, the Atlanta massacre is the most recent link in a long chain of anti-Asian racism in this country. Harassment and violence toward Asian Americans has existed since the first large group of Asian immigrants came to America during the Gold Rush in 1848. And with enough anti-Chinese images and messages circulating, America became a place where one of the largest mass lynchings in our history, the 1871 Chinese massacre, is effectively forgotten. You see, on October 24th, 1871, a mob of 500 white men attacked, robbed, and murdered Chinese residents. And somewhere between 17 to 20 Chinese immigrants were hanged by the mob in the course of the riot. Now, 10 of these men from the mob were prosecuted. 8 were convicted of manslaughter, but all of these convictions were later overturned on appeal due to technicalities. Racism and xenophobia against Asians also led to the first federal immigration law in our country, namely the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Anti-Asian racism and rhetoric continued into the early 20th century with the Yellow Peril myth and the internment of 120,000 Japanese Americans during World War II. 2 white men in 1982 murdered 27-year-old Chinese American Vincent Chin at his own bachelor party in Highland, Michigan, out of anger because they had just lost their jobs to the Japanese auto industry. And they actually thought Vincent was Japanese, not Chinese. And even after this, they got off with 3 years probation and a $3,000 fine. Anti-South Asian fear skyrocketed after 9/11. And I personally remember being asked the week after September 11th if I was a terrorist by my own classmates. Fellow Indians had their properties vandalized, and even for myself, as soon as I heard the news of the shooting in Atlanta, I was triggered by the memories of February 22nd, 2017, when a white man shot 2 Indian men whom he had allegedly mistaken for Iranians at a restaurant, and killing one of them. And he reportedly yelled, "Get out of my country," and calling them terrorists before firing. And now in the time of COVID-19, the Stop AAPI Hate Reporting Center has cataloged almost 4,000 incidents of anti-Asian racism. A Burmese family, including 2 children under the age of 6, were stabbed in Texas while grocery shopping because they were thought to be Chinese. A woman in Brooklyn had acid thrown on her while taking out the trash. Another woman needed stitches after she was attacked by teenage girls. And an elderly Chinese American woman was slapped and then set on fire by 13-year-old teenagers. Now, what aggravates the situation, as author Kathy Park Hong argues, is that we are told, and sometimes we tell ourselves, that our feelings about anti-Asian incidents are, quote, minor. How could we have anything valid to feel or say about race and racism when we are also supposedly accepted by American society as model minorities? And this is the second stereotype that Asian Americans have to contend with. Now, the term model minority was coined in the 1960s by a white journalist, and it perpetuates the belief that Asian Americans are somehow racially smarter or more successful than any other minority group. The myth basically goes like this. Our parents came with nothing on their back to this country. All they had was a shirt and a suitcase, pennies to their name. But because they worked hard, they succeeded. And it's this myth that has led to statements like, all Asians are good at math, or all Asians have such self-discipline, or all Asians are rich and successful. And of course, the problem with this myth is that it assumes Asians are racially smarter and racially more hardworking, as if there's some Oriental magic formula tied to our race. And law professor Frank Wu says that the model minority myth is just false flattery. It's not a compliment because it's used to insult other people of color. So the saying goes, if Asians can succeed in this country, then why can't African Americans? Or why can't Latinos? Or why can't Native Americans? This is how Asians are weaponized and used as a wedge between white people and other minorities. We're used to keep white people safe and to insult the Black, the Latino, and the Native American communities. And we're treated as a pet, falsely imagined as the desirable classmate, the favored neighbor, and the non-threatening kind of person of color. You see, by 1965, our country was entering the height of the civil rights movement, and white America utilized the model minority myth about Asian Americans to demonize African Americans. We were all painted as hardworking, high-achieving, well-behaved citizens. But even this is complicated because only the smartest, the wealthiest, and most successful Asians were even being admitted to the United States during this time. Asia was experiencing this sort of brain drain, yet white America used this intentionally to turn us into a wedge and pit us against African Americans in order to try and undermine the civil rights movement. So, and nevertheless, not all Asian immigrants who come to this country are rich or have relational capital. Asian Americans have the greatest income disparity of any minority group in the US, which basically means we are some of the wealthiest and some of the poorest minorities in this country. And unlike the engineers and doctors who come from Hong Kong, Taiwan, China, India, and who sometimes embody this model minority in the American imagination, many Hmong refugees arrived from a rural life in Laos, devastated by war. And in the midst of their own trauma, they were resettled into poverty and have this complicated history of racial oppression. Many Asians, such as Southeast Asians, including Singaporeans and Indonesians, suffer shame and guilt for not living up to this model minority myth. So to sum this all up, these two stereotypes have led to our marginalization and have catalyzed anti-Asian racism. And, Asian Americans, we live on the margins of both the Asian and American worlds, living in this in-between. I share all this because I want to be clear that the United States has a long history of anti-Asian racism. The Atlanta massacre on March 16th was a racialized act, and it was not an isolated event. And the collective Asian American community is still grieving and lamenting right now. And we do so with the full weight of anti-Asian history on our shoulders. So for those who aren't Asian American and are listening in, I want to invite you to enter into this collective pain of the Asian American community and to see the world through our eyes and our realities of racism and marginalization and erasure, to hear our voices, to listen to our stories and mourn with us. Because understanding the full breadth of the Asian American experience in this country, including the racism that we have endured, is the method by which we will be able to work together toward a more just and equitable future for all.
I want to now go to our final panelist, Reverend Alexandra Zareth, who is a child of God, board-certified chaplain working for the Presbyterian Mission Agency of the Presbyterian Church, USA. Alexandra helps create and implement national and local leadership institutes, community development programs, and has a private executive coaching practice. Reverend Zareth, take it away.
Thank you. Lovely to be here. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I grew up in Mexico in a very devoted, not sure how to pronounce that well, but family of faith who said things like, you are no better than anybody else. You did not do anything to be born in the family that you were born in, right? They're very strict and very direct about that. And they encourage this like radical thing of like not giving away the clothes you don't like, but if you like it, that's the one that Jesus wants you to give away, right? And so I grew up that way, and I was like, okay, that's what Jesus said, that's what I'm doing. And it was really great until I realized that apparently not everybody grew up that way. I was like, wait, what? What do you mean you have 4 of those? It didn't compute. I had this math of like, you have 2 coats, you give 1 away. And maybe that's how my family was actually dealing with their own poverty. And maybe that's, who knows? But that was the family of faith that I had. And I realized at some point, not everybody else is. So where I come from, the dynamic is more about wealth and socioeconomic status, right? So my racialized body, the brunt of the pain at that time came from people who looked just like me. Maybe a little darker, maybe a little paler, but pretty similar. I have to say that it wasn't a topic that I could have said anything about. And then graduate school happened. Then I arrived in the Northeast United States, wide-eyed, bushy-tailed, and excited. And my, what a shock that people who knew absolutely nothing about me suddenly were full of assumptions all about me. They knew nothing, assumed everything, and that was just the norm. How does that happen? I was shocked. I had somebody who said, hey, have you talked to the kitchen staff? I think they're all Mexicans like you. I'm sorry. What? And somebody else who sat with me in a New Testament class saw me in the hallway in the dorm that we lived in and was like, hey, can you clean up the bathroom? Which later I realized, that's right, I look like the cleaning staff. And for all of us that have been through seminary, we're too scared because so many things are happening, 1,000 pages a week to read. Like, ain't nobody got time to really process these moments, right? So years later, I am at this other place in my life where I know that I'm doing the right things. I had taken the ruler that they gave me. I've been measuring all the things, right? I've graduated. I've got a chaplain job. I knew that I had jumped through so many denominational hurdles for ordination. So there I am, sitting in this room where they're examining me, which is totally typical. Those of you who have gone through ordination panels know how that goes. Surrounded by people with titles and degrees, and they're asking you all these things, and everything seemed pretty normal. I was used to that process by then. A very strict systemic process that I won't get into right now, but suddenly the questions took a turn that felt different, just felt different. And now I'll tell you that was about 2008. And so there was a rise in immigration raids around that time. Detention centers were expanding. Immigration law was starting to come down in a particular way that affected really very many people, including people like myself. I was no exception, right? I had by then already been detained multiple times, questioned on numerous occasions, and I had already learned to carry all my paperwork with me, which I do until this day, everywhere, just in case. So what was happening back in that room where something took a turn, it's this moment of like, I'm having these questions by my family of faith. And all of a sudden I am feeling something. I'm feeling intensely inside and deeply, right? That these questions that are coming at me from my family of faith felt very similar to what immigration enforcement officers had asked me before. And police are asking in different ways, several questions, because they're trying to get at what it is that they think you're hiding. That feeling was shocking. I was in that moment because I knew that I had met all these benchmarks. All of a sudden, I was like, what? How is this happening here? Right? So I'm shocked. I felt that stronger. I felt it deeper. I expected it from these other agencies. I didn't expect it here. It was paralyzing. It was paralyzing. Their questioning, was so masked behind things. They were like, well, we just wonder why you don't travel so much because we value family. What? Right? Suddenly they shared that my lifestyle was concerning. My lifestyle? What was my lifestyle? Right? My lifestyle was that I was starting a PhD, I was running a nonprofit, and I had a full-time job because I had to keep food on the table. What lifestyle? That lifestyle, they told me, as they put their hand on the book of order, they say doesn't fit within our paradigm of ordained ministry. You know what? I was still shocked, right? And at that point, I'm like, I can't win. I can't win. And I made a choice, and those words haunt me. That is a direct quote. Those words haunt me, because I've had to question my identity. I've had to question and wrestle. Jesus, are you calling me to this? Because I know it's not the paradigm, right? So I hold on to it, and I use it as a guide to an extent to go back to God, right? And to negotiate my understanding and my discernment, my self-examination as I continue to answer God's call to ministry. And so what's interesting to me, and I am aware today, and I wasn't aware then, is that I made a choice. I made a choice in that day to walk away. I chose not to fight, right? The system paralyzed me, but then eventually I shook out of it and was like, you know what? And my words to them were, well, I'm going to pray about it, right? And I took a step back from leadership positions, from the ministry that I was doing, from everything, right? And could that be labeled a spiritual bypass? I don't think so. I wasn't going to leave it to God and see what happens. No, I took a step back and I said, I'm going to pray about it because I was really concerned and I could only take it back to God, right? I didn't have any more tools, but that's such an important tool that I can say that day I made a choice to walk away and think about what I was really doing. And it's a choice that I think is valuable that some people don't understand, right? Some people want you to fight the fight. Some people, when I left the Catholic church that I grew up in, said, why are you leaving? Fight the fight from within. And I remember telling my sister-in-law, you can go ahead and keep on that fight, girl. I am fighting that fight. Like, I'm so over that fight. I gotta go. I'm in a different fight, I'm picking a different battle. The United States, right? This empire that has been built with and through labor and investment and met much created chaos by some leaders in so many places, has chosen to sort of block out some things from their history, right? It's just kind of like a compartmentalization. That's a choice. It's such an often practice that like people just choose to ignore some of the data, some of this history that you all have already shared. Like we choose to compartmentalize it, put it on a shelf. It's really uncomfortable. So we don't want to go there. And Latino Hispanic history is just the same. Why are American weapons in Central America? Who's funding some of the riots that are happening, that are creating political unrest in some of Latin America? Were there not boats coming to some of our islands and picking up our people and taking them to Staten Island and New York City? Like, what? Some people are here because they came to go get us. They asked us to be here, right? In some cases, maybe it's the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, that destroyed the economy of my country and created poverty that enforced migration, right? Maybe I'm the daughter of somebody who was picking tomatoes and had a heat stroke. And so he died on this land, right? And I stayed. I mean, there's history here. And I am part, like many, right, that are just a product of policy and economic choices that have made this land's infrastructure. And so today, I wonder, like those people wondered, I wonder, why are people compartmentalizing history? And I'm gonna call it out. We assume and we choose to adopt a privileged stance where I already know you. No, you don't know. You don't know. There's no shame in that. Friends, that's a choice, right? Like, I think we must choose. I firmly believe this. We have to choose to not be ignorant, right? We have to choose that when I engage with one another, I'm going to come from a place of, I don't know. I don't know. Some of the data and the stories that you shared today already, I didn't know, right? And while it's vulnerable for me to be like, oops, I had no idea, it's so imperative, right? It's already been said, right? That idea that we must begin in our own bodies, right? That's where the work begins. It's so vital to go inward and start there, right? And we had an invitation to enter into the collective pain of an entire culture, right? Lean into it, like know and recognize that you don't know. We must intentionally choose to not live by assumptions, right? We have to intentionally learn the discipline of what does it mean to be respectfully curious, right? You can be curious, but be respectful. Don't disrespect me. Don't cross the line. Start from a place of acknowledging where you are, and then I'm happy to have a conversation. Happy to. And then us as bodies of culture, right? People of color, to be able to not just react, but be able to say, today I choose to not teach you that. And that's okay. Today, I don't have time. And there will be days where I'm like, girl, sit down. I got number time today. I got a cup of tea. This is great. We're going to go somewhere today. Like own it, right? It's a committed stance of like, hey, I am a student of life. Like I'm here to learn. And I'm not trying to evade the question of like, how has my community been marginalized? I think, unfortunately, recent history has put, my bad hombres on the right. We know we've all heard that. We've all heard of the rapist Mexicans and the people who steal our job, all these illegals. Like, I don't need to go there. I don't need to go there. There are plenty of policies and practice, unfortunately, that have kept marginalizing and excluding the communities, right? Minimizing voice and presence. Puerto Rico is a phenomenal example, although I'm by no means an expert. It's kind of like the District of Columbia. How are you like part, but not part, but like have voice, but not really? Like, and some are like, well, they don't pay taxes, but don't they though? By like, like paying 3 times more for stuff that you don't have to pay for? Like, how does that, okay, I'm gonna leave that there, right? There's these youngins, right? These young people who were told, you know what, let's register you. You came as a child. We totally get it. Register, we're gonna take care of you, AKA DACA, right? The Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And then what happens? A political change that then puts the entire community fearful, hiding disclosures, like we're afraid of why you're asking, what you're asking, what's happening right now. We're a little nervous. Appropriately so. Why is the US Census? Why are we talking about the census sharing the data of how many people live? Wait, who's that data going to? Why is it going to? And if you don't know anything about that, I bet $1 that everybody heard there was something in the news last year about the census and how hard it was. And the reason why it was so hard has to do with these ridiculous policies that continue to racialize certain communities. So it's not news, right? It's not news. It's all over. My concern is this historical compartmentalization that leads folks to forget that for some reason, we might be here similar to what Michelle had said, right? We might be from here. We're actually, for some Latino Hispanic people, the border crossed them. Shout out to the Mexican-American War, right? like, no, we didn't. They've been here their whole lives. That's who this place is. Like, so I'm shifting towards the end of my time here. And I'm thinking of the conference title, right? Reckoning and Reimagining, Envisioning a Faithful Presence in the Liberal Arts. So what stood out to me was a faithful presence. It's a great phrase. And part of the reason why I think it strikes me is because presence is what we chaplains are all about. We're all about, that's our ministry of presence. And if you don't think about it, you'll read through it, it'll slide and you'll just keep going. And you would just assume that presence means being there. But family, I can tell you, from a decade and a half of being in an ER and doing emergency response work, there's no such thing as just being there, right? If I'm going to be there in your most chaotic space and time, the most traumatizing time in your life, I better own my space. I better be anchored. I better know where I'm coming from. I better not react. I better be centered. I better know my space, my place. I better own it. It is totally appropriate the way some people react to trauma, because there are tragic things that are happening in the world and their reaction is completely appropriate. What's not helpful is if I get swept away with everybody else's and their drama and their emotions, right? I need to be anchored. The only way, or I want to be preachy here, but the only way I could be faithful in my presence is if I've done my own work, is if I've thought about where I'm coming from, if I've spent time leaning in and recognizing my privileges, and so that I can feel uncomfortable and I build resilience to like that discomfort feeling while I listen and engage with you, right? That's the goal, I think. That's the thing that I believe is where we might want to walk towards. Right? The faithful presence is like ensuring first that my identity is integrated as in whole. I am whole. And out of that place of wholeness that I acknowledge, that I care for, that I nurture, that place is how I can engage with you. From that place, I'm always learning. I'm always growing. I assume nothing. I'm curiously learning and leaning in. And taking seriously that invitation of like, hey, enter into our collective trauma, say her name and sit with the name, sit with it, right? Learn the story. I can only do that if I'm whole. And I would say that in this country and in these times that choose, because I completely believe it's a choice, they choose to think about a Pollyannic history, a compartmentalization of history, a lack of acceptance of responsibility for their behaviors and for policies that continue. It's a choice that people don't want to face the pain. They don't want to face the discomfort. But we, as the church, as believers, have a choice to make, right? And we have an invitation to lean into that, to reimagine, to reckon and reimagine, and to partner with God, so that we can create a different way of being, so that we can create a different way of like meeting with one another. And I think that when we embrace the complexity of who I am, as we think of intersections, right, of being a female, able-bodied, highly educated, like as we like continue to learn about ourselves, our complexities, it becomes so much easier to recognize that the human in front of me could be just as complex. It's not scary. It's not scary. But it starts with our body, as they have already said today, right? It starts here. I want to leave us with that invitation, right? To think that as we need to build those internal resources so that, or lack thereof in some cases, right? Let's keep it real. So that when we meet the external, we can meet it in a place from health. We can encounter it and not be too uncomfortable that we leave, but be uncomfortable enough and resist it and be resilient and grow together so that we can meet one another with that full vulnerability, which is what we really want. We're designed for it. We want connection. We want it. And it only comes from a place of vulnerability. And so leaning into that and doing the work of building those internal resources and knowing your story, however it is that you need to go and learn it, right? Partnering with someone, whatever it is you need to do to own your space so that you can be faithfully present, because that's, I think, the invitation from the Holy Spirit. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. And I want to follow up this panel now with a Q&A section very briefly for those who can stay. I have just one question that I want to pose to each of the panelists. All three of you talked about the sense of intergenerational trauma. I heard it very much reverberated, and that trauma is something we carry in our own bodies. And epigenetic science has told us that it's written in the very codes of our DNA, and that in order for us to recognize this generational trauma, both personal, individual trauma of families and collective traumas that are now being carried in our own bodies, our own brains, our own emotional spaces, I'm wondering if you can talk about your own process of dealing with those intergenerational traumas, and how do you bring forth that sense of resiliency and resistance? So I'm going to throw that to Dr. Rogers first, and then I ask Dr. Reyes to go, and then we'll end with Dr. Zareth.
Thank you for that question. It's a really good question. And one of the things that I would offer is that it's not just that there's the multi-generational trauma, but the ongoing trauma, right? And so one thing I would say specifically, as we are doing this recording, we are in the midst of the Derek Chauvin trial. And every night on the news, it seems there is the replaying of the image of George Floyd's death. And so I have made it a practice, one, to not watch the trial, but then also to avert my eyes or turn the volume down during the replaying of that, because I think that in and of itself is, it can be a moment of re-traumatization. And in some ways it is a signaling, right? It's a signaling, it's a signal. These are the sorts of bodies that are not safe. And whether or not that's the intent of the media in that moment, that's the signal that's being sent out. And so I think that there was something that Reverend Zareth said that was very helpful around this priority of wholeness. And so I would just offer in the context of both multi-generational trauma and ongoing moments of trauma, and the way that traumas are communicated and reinforced multiple times through the media, the priority of wholeness is a journey. And so there are moments of wholeness, and then moments where we kind of have to fight for that wholeness more. And then to refer to Alice Walker's definition of womanness, moments when we must retreat, right, and prioritize our wholeness in particular kinds of ways. And I think taking the time to discern which one of those is most important in any given moment is a particular kind of responsibility, and unfortunately an added burden that has to be a priority if we are to heal from trauma and to find a way to not pass that on to future generations, whether it's biologically or in other ways. Are there ways that we can prioritize wholeness that mitigates or interrupts the transmission of that trauma to the next generation?
Yeah, I loved everything that Dr. Rogers said. I completely agree with that. I think something that I just heard recently from David Bailey, I really love the way he said that, proximity leads us toward empathy, and empathy leads us towards unity. And I think there is something powerful about having this understanding of the ways in which our mothers, our grandmothers, our great-great-grandparents have experienced similar types of racial trauma, or also that question of it that could have been my mother, that could have been my grandmother. And so on the one hand, I completely agree with what Dr. Rogers is saying, that there is that need for balance, for self-care, for understanding how much we engage with these pains and these histories, and particularly videos and things like that. But then also I think the other side of that same coin is growing in our both individual and racial consciousness, and understanding how real and personal this is, because I think that is what then catalyzes us to want to move towards change, not only in our own life, but communally and systemically as well. And so, I think for activists like myself and for others that I know that are in this space seeking to address racial justice, it is incredibly personal. And by the time this video comes out, Barna is going to have released a new study called Beyond Diversity, which addresses the ways in which the church as a whole still doesn't feel the need to address racial injustice. The percentages are still very low, not only for white Christians, but Asian Christians as well, and others. And I think that oftentimes that lack of proximity and that lack of empathy is what leads to these sorts of things. So in the midst of all of this, I am hoping that those sorts of intentional movement toward the real pain and brokenness it motivates us to address these issues. And then, as you mentioned as well, Dr. O, with the hope toward not only systemic change, but resilience. And I love how Sheila Wise talks about that in her book, Journey Towards Racial Healing, that our goal should be to get well and stay well. And I think the ways in which we do it is by working through our stories and collectively fighting against injustice together.
There is just so much that I would just be like, yes, amen, amen, amen. So much I could say. It's not fair. Our time is so limited. I will start with saying amen, like I said, to everything that's been said. I want to offer a couple of definitions, right? Trauma can be when your internal resources can't meet the external, right? So I can't tell you what is traumatic for you. You can't tell me what's too traumatic for me. Because today my resources, if I haven't slept well, if my 4-year-old is sick, like my mother's got COVID, whatever's happening might deplete my internal resources too. So today, what I'm facing could be really big, right? Even if it doesn't seem big to you. And so number one, where you are right now is imperative for you to know, right? And awareness brings choice. So when you know where you are today, you're better able to face what's next. And so give yourself that compassion, that grace that you would give to your best friend, right? You'd be like, girl, don't take it so, girl, you didn't sleep. Now you know how you get without your coffee, right? Like the way you would tell somebody that you love and you'd have so much compassion for them. Meet yourself in the mirror and tell yourself that, right? Whatever you're going through right now is okay. And where you are today is where you need to be right now. And so to give yourself that permission is vital, because we are undergoing a collective trauma of a pandemic, which is going to affect all of us. It is affecting all of us. We are normalizing how we talk about it, how we remember it. That's exactly what Holocaust survivors have had to do. That is what slavery survivors, that's how you process these big things. So we're in the middle of it. So know your place, know your body, recognize that you're a biopsychosocial spiritual being. Jesus ate and slept and went to weddings and then retreated. That's our example. So know where you are today, recognize it, love on it, give yourself permission to turn off the television, to put it on mute, leave it on, but on mute. Ain't nobody trying to hear that right now. That's okay. That's okay. And when you're invited to lean into somebody's discomfort, be like, I'm doing it. I'm doing it even if it makes me uncomfortable. I'm learning her name, even if it means pain. I'm looking at the truth because I'm going to get stronger like everything else. And so it is possible. And I'm glad that we have each other and we have to choose to be together, right? It's real easy to go be alone. That's not the call. we're called to be the body of Christ. We're called to be together. We're called to recognize that the foot is not greater than the eye. Like, that is the Bible. And so as we have that invitation, lean into it. Lean into it.
I want to now take this time to thank my panelists, Dr. Rogers, Dr. Reyes, and Dr. Zareth. I mean, you're going to be doctor soon, so I'm going to call you that, a prophecy in the making. I just am so grateful for your insights, for speaking from your own personal space, as well your community's spaces, and recognizing what a gift this time was, even for me, just to hear you all and to be in solidarity. I think that's part of this work, is to build solidarity, to say, you're my sister by choice. I choose you every day to be in relationship and to, as body of Jesus Christ, that I will shower not only grace upon me and my people, but I will also shower grace upon you and your people. And that together we will claim our Christian vocation to be curious about each other and to pray for each other. Thank you so much for being here. I am delighted and honored to be in your presence. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. O. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.